I'm Howard Louth, and I'm the director for the Center for Austrian Studies, and we're so pleased to have you here. We're actually so pleased that the weather cooperated as well. It might be global warming, but we can at least, there are positive sides to it, and so thank you for coming out this evening. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to thank a number of co-sponsors that have made this event possible right here. I've got my list right here. That's right, here we go. Our co-sponsors include the Consortium for the Study of the Pre-Modern World, the Center for Early Modern History, the Center for German and European Studies, the Program of Religious Studies, the Germanic American Institute, and the Anselm House, Christian Studies Center here. We, in fact, will be circulating some sign-up lists if you're interested to learn a little bit more of what we at the Center for Austrian Studies do. We'd be more than happy to communicate with you. I believe we have our Austrian Studies news magazine circulating with a wonderful picture of Martin Luther, but just to disorient you a little bit, you can sort of try to guess what the language is. It's not German, that sort of surrounds it right there, but it's Czech. We will have a sign-up sheet for the Austrians, for the Center for Austrian Studies, but the Anselm House has decided as well to raffle off a couple copies of Brand Luther, the book of our featured book of our speaker this evening. And for those of you who study, who sign up to get some more information about the Anselm House, you'll be automatically entered into their drawing. Now let me say just a bit about our speaker this evening. Our speaker has come a long way to spend some time with us. Our speaker is Professor Andrew Pettegree from St. Andrews University in Scotland. There he is Professor of Modern History and the Director of the Universal Short Title Catalog. I encourage all of you to go online to find out about this project. It's rather ambitious. It's a project that is intended to catalog, to provide a database of all books published in Europe from the invention of printing up to the end of the 16th century. Now, our speaker, Professor Pettegree, is really, in his presentation today, I think, combining two of his most important intellectual interests. He really began as a Reformation historian and continues to publish in that area. But he's also a noted and leading figure in book print studies as well. So he's bringing these two interests together with the figure of Martin Luther and the making of a media phenomenon in Luther. I can highlight a number of his books just very quickly: The Reformation and the Culture of Persuasion, The Book in the Renaissance, The Invention of the News, which I should note won the Goldsmith Prize from the Kennedy School of Government of Harvard University. And then, of course, most recently, Brand Luther. So we're very pleased, and let me hand this over now to Professor Pettegree, who will be speaking to us tonight on Martin Luther, the Reformation, and the making of a media phenomenon. So, Professor Pettegree.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming out this evening, and thank you, Howard, for that warm welcome. This is a first visit for me to Minnesota. What a time to come. When Howard asked me, I said I would come as long as I got the chance to have my first American election stateside. I wasn't at the time aware what a fun time he was serving up for me. Anyway, I thought I would start by just telling you how I came to write the book that that Howard is going to raffle up, and I must say I've never been a raffle prize before. In July of 2011, I received, rather out of the blue, a letter from Scott Moyes of Penguin, USA. He'd been reading the book In the Renaissance, which was a book I'd written before, and he wanted me to write a book on Europe in 1517. I think this is what he had in mind. This very successful book by James Shapiro on 1599, a year in Shakespeare's life. I wanted to work with Penguin, but I didn't want to write that book. The problem is that whereas 1599 was a very eventful year, actually nothing happens in 1517 until Luther posts his theses right at the end of the year. So I pitched back to him something different, the book that ultimately became Brand Luther. And as Howard has already said, that gave me something, a chance to do something I've always wanted to do, which was to unite the two strands of my work. The strand working on the Reformation with my more recent work on the history of the book. And that was the question which animated this book and my paper today, the creation of a media phenomenon. Well, how did Luther become a media phenomenon? It wasn't likely. He was middle-aged before he published anything at all. He wasn't a young man like John Calvin, for instance, intent on fame. Indeed, there was nothing in the first 30 years of Luther's life to suggest here was a man who would convulse a continent. It was extraordinary that a man who had built a steady and in a modest way successful career within the church should suddenly repudiate both the institution, the church, and its spiritual leadership. It was even more extraordinary that he should survive to tell the tale. When at the height of the Luther affair, the first fury of public debate following his attack on the Pope, when at the height of this Luther journeyed across Germany to face the judgment of the German Empire at the Diet of Worms, he did not expect to leave Worms alive. That he had reached this climactic moment at all, he owed to the solid support of his own local ruler, Frederick the Wise, who was a devout Catholic who never left the faith. In this, and in so many other respects, Luther's career was a pyramid of multiple improbabilities. Luther owed his notoriety during these years to another of the Reformation's extraordinary improbabilities. That a monk who into his 30th year had published nothing should somehow reinvent himself as a writer and polemicist of astonishing power. Luther, in effect, invented a new form of theological writing. Short, clear, direct, speaking not only to his professional peers in the church, but to a wider Christian people. And Luther achieved all this from a thoroughly improbable place, a small, inconsequential market town on Europe's eastern periphery, a place which to this point has scarcely figured in the annals of European history, Wittenberg. Now, Luther himself was distinctly unimpressed when he first passed through the gates of Wittenberg. He had found Wittenberg, he later recalled, on the edge of civilization. Had it been only a little further east, it would have been in mediam barbarian, in the middle of the barbarians. Now, other visitors at this time were equally unflattering. Wittenberg was a poor, unattractive town, with old, small, ugly wooden houses, more like a village than a town. Not surprisingly, when Luther's views had stirred notoriety, these were sentiments his enemies were eager to echo. Johannes Kochleus was the first man to write a biography of Luther, and it was a hostile one, he was a Catholic. And this is what he had to say about Wittenberg. Wittenberg is a miserable, poor, dirty village. In comparison to Prague, hardly worth 3 farthings. In fact, it's not worthy to be called a town in Germany. It has an unhealthy, disagreeable climate. It's without vineyards, orchards, or fruit-bearing trees of any kind. Dirty homes, unclean alleys, all roads, paths, and streets are full of filth. It has a barbarous people who make their living from breweries and saloons, and a body of merchants not worth 3 cents. George, Duke of Albertine, Saxony, enemy and rival of Luther's patron Frederick the Wise, put it more succinctly, in a single sentence, that a single monk, he said, out of such a hole could undertake a reformation is not to be tolerated. Indeed, one of the reasons the papacy may have been so slow in reacting to Luther was that they could really not conceive of something so important emerging from such a place. So today we have to try and discern how this happened and how print played its part in this. But first we have to acknowledge one further truth, that the triumph of printing, was itself not preordained. Now this represents a fundamental challenge to our understanding, because the transition from manuscript to print is always treated as a seismic moment for European society, a technological revolution bound to succeed. So it's well to remember that when Johann Gutenberg began his experiments with movable type in the 1440s, it was by no means obvious that this was an invention that Europe needed. Europe was already full of books, beautiful, handcrafted manuscript books. More to the point, even after Gutenberg had exhibited his wonderful printed Bible, printing almost faltered. Gutenberg himself was bankrupted by his project, even though the Bible was massively expensive and had immediately sold out. Now this was experimental technology, but for the next 40 years people struggled to make it work. In the first age of print, few made money from printed books. On the contrary, bankruptcy and failure was the normative experience of those involved in the printing industry. Now this, of course, is a different narrative to that which is normally offered, where print makes a triumphant march across Europe. Here we hear that as news of Gutenberg's great achievement spread, every prince, bishop or town council wanted to have a press on their territory. Print spread quickly through Germany, Italy and France, and thence more haltingly to Europe's periphery, England, Spain, Scandinavia. By 1500 there were 200 places in Europe which had had a printing press. But what this model does not dwell on is that most of these ventures, unsuitably located in small cities away from major centres of population, closed after publishing only a handful of titles. It took some time for the fatal flaw in the business model to become apparent. And that was this. It was comparatively easy to print 300, 500, or even 1,000 copies of a printed text. It was far more difficult to sell them. The impact of this becomes very evident when we look at a series of maps showing the growth of printing. Here we have the opening of print in the first 20 years. I'm going to try and use this now. And we see print spreading basically up the Rhine Valley. And if we move on forward to 1470, we can see a very rapid spread, but still a concentration on the major centres of population between the mouth of the Rhine in the Netherlands, down the Rhine to the major German cities, and then across the Alps into Italy. If we scroll on, these were visualizations which we made from the data in the Universal Short Title Catalog. We can see that we have the beginnings here of mega printing centres in Paris and Venice, but other places are coming and going. There's all these rural places in small towns in France, the failure to create a major centre of printing in Spain, and only one centre of printing in England, London. And that's how it remains till the end of the century. Paris even bigger, Venice even bigger, major conglomerations here, but the periphery really not taking part in this print world to any considerable extent. Now, I think these charts lay bare the essential problem of print. These lay not with the technology, which had been mastered by the time Gutenberg published his Bible, but the economics of sales, the far more difficult task of how to create a commercial infrastructure. How that is to master a whole series of problems which did not really apply in the manuscript world. The manuscript world depended on retail transactions. You wanted a book, you sourced the copy, you got a scribe to copy it. It was very intimate and singular. But in the print world, you had to raise venture capital for the long interval between the beginning of the project and having anything to sell. Then you had to find customers who might be spread all around Europe, and then you had to get the books to them. This is a very expensive process which ate away at your profits. The answer to these problems, painfully derived after 30 years of experimentation and failure, was to be guided by those who had this sort of experience. And that was the wealthy merchants who dominated Europe's transnational luxury trades. These were men who knew what was necessary to make the new trade work. Raising capital, transporting books in bulk to major markets where they could be traded, often by exchange for other books. They knew how to arrange storage for the many hundredweight of paper before an edition could be disposed of, and how to handle the complicated business of loans and exchange transactions. So the book trade, in fact, contracts during this period. Although books were indeed sold in some 200 places before the end of the 15th century, 2/3 of them were produced in only 12 cities. All of them were large commercial centres, 6 in Germany, 4 in Italy, and 2 in France. And this iron geography of book production would prove remarkably enduring. Only 2 new cities make their progress into this elite in the first half of the 16th century, Antwerp and London. And this was a world which should have had no place for Wittenberg. And this is initially exactly how it turned out. The experimental age of printing, the 15th century, passed Wittenberg by altogether. Such books as the inhabitants of this small city needed were furnished by Erfurt and Leipzig, 2 larger cities nearby, both of which had an early printing industry. The first printing press was not established in Wittenberg until 1502 as a service to the new university. But between 1502 and 1516, the year before Luther's story gets underway, 5 printers came and went in Wittenberg, publishing a total of only 123 books in those 14 years, an average of 8 books a year. All were in Latin, and most were very small. Here's an example of one of those early Wittenberg imprints, and you can see it's very basic. None of the decoration on the title page that we'll see a little later, a rather undifferentiated body of text. This is very typical of the 1470s. Wittenberg was having its experimental age a generation late. Now let's look at the Luther effect. And here I'm going to give you a graphic from the Universal Title Catalogue, the resource we have in St Andrews. And here I've done the search, Wittenberg printing 1517 to 1546. And this produces 2,721 titles, totally different state of affairs. An average of 90 a year. This represents about 3 million individual copies. It includes many of the milestone works of the era, including multiple editions of Luther's German Bible. Now this vast blossoming of what was essentially a new era was entirely due to Martin Luther. 1 in 3 of all the books published during these 3 decades were Luther's own works, and another 20% were those of his Wittenberg colleagues and followers. And this Luther effect proved enduring. Even after his death, the industry continued to grow. Wittenberg became Germany's largest print centre, eclipsing established centres of the book trade like Strasbourg and Cologne. Thanks to its favourite son, Wittenberg had subverted the iron economics of publishing, the apparent requirement that major production centres could only be located in Europe's principal commercial cities. And this was a transformation that seemed to many contemporaries quite miraculous, as it did to Luther, who could never quite understand his own success as an author. Now, Luther, as we know, first came to prominence from his attack on indulgences, the 95 Theses whose posting we now celebrate as the start of the Reformation. It was interesting, celebrating this as the start of the Reformation only started 100 years later in 1617. Until this point, Luther had built a decent career as a respected member of his local Augustinian order. But he was scarcely known outside the immediate circles of this religious order. We know this from a remarkable document, probably drawn up as part of a student recruitment campaign for the universities of northeastern Germany. Now, this document provides a list with biographical sketches of 101 distinguished professors at the universities of Leipzig, Wittenberg, and Frankfurt an der Oder. Now, none of these institutions was really in the front rank of Europe's universities. Yet, even in this relatively undistinguished company, there was no place in the top 100 for Wittenberg's professor of biblical theology, Martin Luther. Now, the reason for this neglect is not difficult to see, because in 1515, when this document was drawn up, Luther had published nothing. His first tentative steps into print only came in 1560, the year before the Indulgence controversy. Yet, within 4 years of this event, Luther would be one of the most famous men in Germany. By 1521, indeed, he was already the most published living author in Europe. Now, this notoriety began in 1517 with the attack on indulgences. When Luther took aim against indulgences in his 95 Theses, he was attacking, as we know, a hugely important institution, the cornerstone of popular devotion, and a mainstay of the church economy, which is why the church was so alarmed. What is less widely appreciated is that the attack on indulgences also threatened an extremely lucrative part of the printing industry. Among the few surviving prints we know were authentically by Johannes Gutenberg are 2 certificates of indulgence. Now, I've spoken of the difficulties of publishing books when they take so long to publish, difficult to get to their sales, very expensive process. Indulgences, on the other hand, was ideal work for a printer. This was a single sheet of paper, like this. This is in the Pitt Rivers collection in Georgia, in Atlanta. Single sheet of paper, printed on one side only. So long as the printer could source the required paper, it was a straightforward job. Furthermore, this sort of work had the priceless advantage that here the printer was working for a single client. Instead of having to go out and sell these works, they just delivered the whole bundle to the bishop or churchman who was going to then offer the certificates in return for donations. There were none of the complex problems of distribution and sale connected with the retailing of books. And the demand for such works was enormous. This was the great age of indulgence selling. We know of one contract for 130,000 certificates like this. Another for the monastery of Montserrat in Catalonia was for 200,000 indulgence certificates. Now the campaign for the rebuilding of St. Peter's Church in Rome from 1515 to 1517 brought forth a similar cascade of print. Interestingly, among those who printed the various artifacts required for this campaign, of which this was part, the idea is here, you see it's a form, and you fill in the name of the person making the donation and the date at the bottom, and then these then get taken away. Very few of these survive with the name filled in, because what tends to come down to it is surplus stock, which survives because it was often reused in the binding of books, and then these things reappear when the binding is repaired. Among those who printed these works were some of Germany's most accomplished printers. They included Melchior Lothar in Leipzig, Sylvain Ottmar in Augsburg, Adam Pettegree in Basel. Within 4 years, all these men would be printing Luther. So they served the church, and then Luther criticised the church, they smoothly swapped sides. There's very little room for sentiment in commerce. Once Luther took aim at indulgences, all of this happened remarkably quickly. He exhibited his 95 Theses against indulgences on the 31st of October 1517. In the established narrative, he walks across town, he knocks on the church door, and he bangs on with a nail. Now, most of that is true, in the sense that the indulgences really were exhibited on the church door, but they were probably glued on, and they were probably glued on by some lowly official who did it on Luther's behalf. The clinching argument which one friend made to me said, "Have you ever known a German professor do his own paperwork?" Now, 8 weeks before this, Luther had penned 108 theses against scholastic theology, and that should have been a more controversial subject, and that was thought to have been lost altogether until it reappeared in the binding of the book in 1983. With indulgences, it was different, and print here was the key. Within a few years, the original Wittenberg edition, which is lost, had been reprinted 3 times, in Leipzig, in Nuremberg, and in Basel. The first 2, this and the one I showed you before, were broadsheets to be stuck up. The other, the Basel edition, was a very neat pamphlet, as we see when we look inside it, organised in 3 groups of 25 and 1 group of 20. It was this edition, incidentally, that in March 1518, Erasmus sent to his friend Thomas More in England. And it's with this edition that it really enters the bloodstream of European intellectual life. Because these theses had had such publicity, opponents pretty much had to respond. They did so in a meeting of the Dominican order at Frankfurt under Oder. And the Dominicans closed ranks around the seller of indulgences, John Tetzel. And at this moment, it's looking like a fight between Augustinians and Dominicans, a pretty traditional medieval spat. So Luther decided he had to defend himself against Tetzel's counter-theses. And it's here, really, that he broke new ground. I would have argued that, in many respects, the Reformation starts in 1518 with the publication of this book. Because the indulgences were a fairly normal part of universal disputation, but this was different. It's too late to change the celebration now, but we can all come back in 2 years' time. Now in itself, the sermon on Indulgence and Grace, here, would not be a major contribution to the ongoing theological debate, but it was an instant publishing sensation. It appeared in 2 Wittenberg editions, and by the end of the year it had been reprinted in Leipzig 4 times, and twice each in Nuremberg, Augsburg, in Basel. In other words, it made its way through all of the major centres of population. And this set a pattern that would be followed for almost all of Luther's vernacular works for the following years of controversy. An instant success in Wittenberg, followed by republication in the major citadels of German print. In this way, Luther swiftly made his way into the homes of thousands of his fellow citizens, who had probably never before owned a book by a living German author. The Sermon on Indulgence and Grace alerted the German printing industry to Luther's potential value. But what is perhaps most remarkable about this modest, unassuming work is what it reveals about Luther's completely unexpected facility as a vernacular writer. This was Luther's first serious foray into vernacular writing, yet it can be described as a work of intuitive genius. Luther here replaces the 95 propositions of the Theses with 20 short paragraphs, each developing a single aspect of his teaching. None is more than 3 or 4 sentences long. The sentences are short and direct. The whole work is a mere 1,500 words. It fits perfectly into an 8-page pamphlet. Now this was a revolution in theological writing, for this was not an age which in general valued brevity. Sermons could last for 2 or 3 hours. They were tests of endurance. This was rather the point of them. Luther, in contrast, had produced a sermon that could be read or read aloud in 10 minutes and still engage the heart of the question. And I think this was the truly revolutionary aspect of his writing. Over the next 4 years, Luther would write 45 more original writings. In 1518 and 1519 alone, another 20 in 1520. They were published in a staggering 565 editions. But Luther was not satisfied. In particular, he could not be satisfied with the quality of the Wittenberg contribution to this print onslaught. Now here was the problem. Until Luther, Wittenberg had been a tiny outpost of printing. Most of the books needed in the university were furnished from elsewhere. The local press pottered on, producing unambitious literary works for the local professoriate and the formal paperwork of academic life, such as dissertation texts. It relied on a single shop with probably a single press run by a steady, dependable man named Johann Rau Grunenberg. Now, Rau Grunenberg was quite happy to take on Luther's works. This is one of his early efforts. Indeed, he was a fervent and devoted follower of Luther's teaching, but he could not adapt his working method to deal with the new demand for Luther's writing. Worst of all, Rau Grunenberg's limited range of types and limited imagination, it must be said, could conceive of nothing stylistically more ambitious than pale imitations of the sort of utilitarian Latin work he produced for the university. Here's another work of this era. He's trying something a bit more dainty here, but as you see, he makes a complete mess of it. And the type sort of crawls down the page, it's very irregular. And if you think back to those editions I showed you of the Sermon on Indulgence and Grace, and they were very poised look, highly decorated. This is painful for Luther. By 1518, this was a serious problem, both aesthetically and in practical terms. During 1518, Rau Grunenberg's press was clogged up printing a serious Latin work for Luther, and this forced him to send more and more of his original works out of Wittenberg to be published elsewhere. It was clear Wittenberg needed another press. Now, Luther we think of as a theologian and a teacher, but he's also an entrepreneur. Faced with a problem, he set about sorting it out. His choice fell on Melchior Lothar, the printer of Leipzig, by now a veteran of the German print world and one of the most accomplished of Leipzig's printers. The most substantial obstacle in the case of Lothar was that he had a perfectly satisfactory relationship with the Catholic Church. Indeed, he printed, to this point, many of the most substantial attacks on Luther, and he'd also printed the works in the Indulgence controversy, to which Luther had taken special exception. So you can see that this was actually a very pragmatic alliance. What seems to have attracted Luther was Luther's reputation as a publisher of serious works of Latin scholarship. In May 1519, Luther made a first visit to Luther in Wittenberg. He came to pitch for the post as second printer. And he was very clever. He brought with him some samples of the sort of work he would do. He said if he was given the job, he would be able to print things like Froben did in Basel. Froben was seen as the sort of epitome of gracious humanist quality. And Luther was entirely captured by this possibility. Now, Lothar was too well established in Leipzig to be able to move himself. So what he did is he sent his son, Melchior Jr., to Wittenberg with some of his typefaces, and indeed he bought some more from Basel to come good on his promise that there would be sophisticated typefaces. And this new press was up and running by the end of 1519, and here we have one of the Leipzig works to see, which were a test of its quality, and here was the son's work in Wittenberg. So you can see a step change of a very considerable time since Raoul Grunenberg. With this, the look of Wittenberg Luther editions improves immeasurably. But the style, the proficiency was that of Leipzig, but so was the style. As you can see, if I just scroll back to Dad's work, it's very similar. There's nothing distinctively Wittenberg about these works. To create a specific Wittenberg style, the city's printers had to make use of their greatest latent asset. For Augsburg and Leipzig had the greater capital resources, the larger printing heritage and the better established print shops. But what Wittenberg had was Lucas Cranach, one of the great artists of the German Renaissance. Now, it's as an artist that Cranach is best known to us today. The man who created the great sequence of portraits of Luther, by which we know him today, and also of his friends and his wife. Luther and Cranach were close and firm allies in the work of the Reformation. What's less well known is that Cranach was also a major player in the Wittenberg book industry. From 1521 he ran his own press, and with characteristic thoroughness he also obtained a paper mill, so he would have a limitless supply of paper. Cranach, in fact, ran his own press for only a few years, but even after he sold it on, he remained intimately involved in the local printing industry, since his workshop enjoyed an effective monopoly of the production of illustrative woodcuts. And it was this that allowed Cranach to transform the look of Wittenberg books. To this point, Wittenberg imprints had been, as we saw with Raoul Grunenberg, spare, utilitarian, unimaginative. Printers outside Wittenberg had improved the look somewhat with decorative borders. Cranach offered a radically new solution. Instead of borders, this is a title page frame in one piece into which the text can be dropped. Now, you also notice that it is light, airy, and so it doesn't actually draw attention away from the text in the middle. It's very delicately done. Now, this was a masterpiece of design innovation, with one step solving the complex problem of integrating text and decorative material while allowing space for imaginative artistic expression on the front of the book. Now, until this point, grand woodcut title page designs would have been largely available only for the largest, most expensive books. Cranach's exquisite work now adorned pamphlets that might sell for no more than a few pence. The result of Cranach's involvement is a whole series of masterpieces in miniature, bringing to the title pages of Wittenberg's Reformation Flugschriften a balance, poise, and sophistication that they had to this point entirely lacked. And I think a statement was being made that the message of the Reformation, Luther's message, deserved to be arrayed like this in magnificence. In the process, and thanks to Cranach's decisive innovation, the Wittenberg book was catapulted from the back to the front of the pack in terms of aesthetic appeal. Now, this distinctive look is the final component in the puzzle that had been taxing Germany's printers since the early days of the Reformation. How to make the most of their most marketable property, that is, Martin Luther. Now every element is in place. A title page border that arrested the eye, and a text that highlighted the two most important elements of what was on offer: the name, Martin Luther, and the place, Wittenberg. And the most important thing in this title page is the white space, where nothing is written, the gaps. Because up until this point, the name of the author was often buried in the body of the title. And very often, the name was spread over two lines. Here we have Martin, we have Luther, we have Wittenberg. Another example here, Martin was Luther, Wittenberg. And you have to imagine these things being sold on a table like we have here, piled up with other pamphlets and books. And you have to imagine most of the customers who have come close to see them have uncorrected sight, like I do here. And so this sort of thing is as an important sales technique. It's not only branding, but it's a form of identification, a livery, if you like. Now, this, I think, is brand Luther. And another testimony, if you like, to its success is the fact that Cranach's beautiful title pages were almost immediately counterfeited elsewhere in Germany. They are redrawn. I have a student in St Andrews who's doing a study of these counterfeits, and he's found, I think, about 125 examples on different books. And here we see the original and then the counterfeit. And you can see the differences in detail in non-essential points. This is one of Cranach's most beautiful designs. It shows that in an age of weak copyright, printing was an industry that evolved through imitation. When printers went to the Frankfurt Fair, they went as much to look as to buy, to look at what other people were doing and to incorporate that into their technology. Now, what had occurred in Wittenberg, the great explosion of energy in the printing industry, was a microcosm of what was happening elsewhere in Germany. So great was the demand for Luther's works, there was enough for anyone. And because the works were so small, and because the demand was so enormous, the printers had the opportunity to make immediate profit and recoup the capital invested. This meant that this was a trade available for people without huge capital resources to set up a big business. Thus, the diversification of print, which had so spectacularly failed in the 15th century, was available now due to the new markets created by Luther. The point I want to emphasize is that this was very much Luther's own achievement. Not only because he provided printers with such good copy, but he also had a very good understanding of how to write for print, the right length, the right style, the best package. And this is, I think, the greatest improbability of the Reformation. How a middle-aged monk, rather set in his ways, could grasp the essentials of this new medium. Luther was a hands-on author in every sense. He would be in and out of the print shops, supervising, cajoling, badgering the printers. He was very impatient of sloppy work, and he would tell them so. Now, most of these conversations occur face-to-face and leave no historical record. But we do get to know of them on those rare occasions when Luther is forced to leave Wittenberg for an extended period, like the 10 months he spent in the Wartburg Castle for his own protection in 1521. And this is the room that they will show you as Luther's study when you visit there. He found this inactivity extremely trying, but he could write, and he did that endlessly. He wrote for publication, he sent the publications back to Wittenberg, they sent the proofs for him to correct, he sent the corrected proofs back with his instructions. And I want to read you from one of his letters to a friend about the printing works he received. For this moment I am Martin Luther. I have received the second and third set of printed sheets of the book On Confession from you. I cannot say how unhappy and disgusted I am with the printing. I wish I had sent nothing in German. It is printed so poorly, so carelessly and confusedly, to say nothing of the bad typefaces and paper. John the printer, this is Raoul Gutenberg, who was always getting them there. John the printer is always the same old John and does not improve. For goodness sake, under no circumstances, let him print any of the German apostles. What I have sent of them should be stored away, or rather returned to me, so that I may send it somewhere else. Now this is a big threat. He's promising to send it not to Wittenberg, but to somewhere else, to punish him. Therefore, I am sending you nothing now, although I have finished almost 10 large manuscript sheets of the apostles. I shall send nothing more until I have seen that these sordid money grubbers in printing books care less for their profits than for the benefit of the reader. For what does a printer seem to think except, it is enough that I get my money. Let the readers worry about what and how they will read it. Now clearly he was bored and angry, but honestly, for Raoul Gutenberg, so often the guilty party, Luther added that he was much more satisfied with the printed sheets of another work, printed by Melchior Lorter. And this was very much Luther's way, to divide his works up between different printers in this manner. If he didn't like what one was done, he would order any reprints to be handled by another shop. In these matters, Luther ruled absolutely. If they wanted his work, the printers did it at the toll. Now, in 1530, Luther left Wittenberg again, this time to observe the imperial diet from the safety of Castle Coburg. He was an outlaw, so he couldn't go to Augsburg. Once again, he found relief in the fury of writing. Interestingly, he wrote 11 works while he was at Coburg Castle, and they were distributed among 5 different Wittenberg printers. Now, that's interesting because it shows how much the industry had grown by 1530. But it also shows that Luther was conscious that he couldn't choose favourites. If he wanted the industry to grow, he had to spread it all around. And this time, his instructions went not to Spalatin, but to his wife, Katharina, whose job it was to be his enforcer in Wittenberg while he was away, a task she though it was well suited for him. In September, it was Hans Weiss who was in the firing line, this time for refusing to publish Luther's exposition of Psalm 117. Why, Luther asked, had he not wanted to do it? Well, actually, the reason was clear enough, because Luther had already had this work printed by a small printer who had work in Coburg, a sort of thank you for having me present, and Weiss simply didn't think there was enough room for another edition. So Luther ordered this task should be reassigned to Georg Rau, who was his favourite printer at the moment. Now, all of this was very trying, but by now the printers had learned to live with Luther. They endured his outburst because he had brought them such a priceless asset, his own enduringly popular works. In the course of the 16th century, Luther's works were published in around 5,000 editions, and a quarter of these were in Wittenberg. As a result, Wittenberg's publishers became some of the city's richest citizens, and the whole city enjoyed an economic renaissance. And this explains one remarkable conversation that took place in the summer of 1539. By this point, Luther is quite an old man. And around the end of June, the printers of Wittenberg approached Luther in a deputation with an extraordinary proposition. That in return for a guarantee of first access to any future works, they would have provided him with a supplementary annual income of 400 gulden. Now this was serious money. Luther's salary was never more than 200, so they were promising to triple his salary, simply with the promise that he would give them what he was already giving them for free. Now Luther refused. He preferred to make no money from his books, printed always in God's cause. Actually, he could well afford this high-mindedness, thanks partly to his wife, who was a very capable businesswoman, who kept the household well provided for and brought in considerable extra income from her various business ventures. She ran a brewery, for instance. Luther was comfortably off, but that's not the real point. What is remarkable about this story is that the printers were prepared to pay so much at a time when Luther's productivity was declining steeply. There could be no more graphic demonstration of Luther's personal importance to the industry that made Wittenberg, and indeed made the fortune of the friends in the industry whose generosity Luther now politely refused. By the time of Luther's death, in 1546, the city had been reborn as the wooden houses which the visitors of Luther's early days sneered at, being replaced in stone with these beautiful Renaissance buildings. This is one of the many houses owned by Lucas Cranach in the city, and it now houses the so-called Cranach House. Luther was not only the city's inspirational leader, he was also the major driver of the local economy. Now, at the heart of this was the print industry, hugely expanded since the days of Raoul Gutenberg. The scale of this transformation can be observed if we turn finally to Luther's Bible. Now, the first edition of the Bible was Luther's New Testament of September 1522, a milestone in the Reformation, but printing this book in Wittenberg required an enormous logistical effort. The creation of a new publishing consortium involving Lucas Cranach, his partner Christian Düring, and the printer Luther. It is a great success, but the New Testament, of course, is only a small part of the whole Bible text, and it was not until 1534 that that was ready for the press. Now, this was not a book that could be undertaken in a small shop. This was a folio of some 600 leaves, not indeed dissimilar to this marvellous catalogue of the local Luther exhibition. Luft simplified the task by dividing it in this way into 5 self-contained parts. This allowed the printing to proceed on several presses simultaneously. But the project still required an enormous investment capital, simply to produce a sufficient quantity of paper and keep the presses rolling. That Luft could achieve this so effortlessly and still make money shows how far the industry had come in these less than 20 years. We started this evening with one magnificent Bible, that of Johannes Gutenberg in 1454. It was a milestone of the printer's art, but it bankrupted its creator. 80 years later, Hans Luft had managed a similar task quite smoothly, and in a place, Wittenberg, which all the natural economics of the trade suggested should not have had a printing industry at all. The success of Wittenberg defied the natural geography of print. It was far removed from the major centres of commerce in Europe and separated from the established infrastructure of distribution. But Luther's magnetic power somehow overcame these difficulties. Luther also, as we have seen, intervened directly, both to improve the quality of local print and to ensure that an ever larger share was kept for Wittenberg itself. For all that, Luther's movement was transformative not just for this small town in northeastern Germany, poised on the edge of civilization, but for Germany as a whole. The new genre invented by Luther, the small pamphlet, or Flugschriften, led the industry towards a new market, new readers, and a new business model. And as the fires of the Reformation dimmed, printers sought out new forms of cheap print, not least the first news pamphlets like this. And you can see a close cousinship between these pamphlets on the news and the pamphlets of the Reformation. They appealed to many of the same readers. The early 17th century would see the introduction of new serial publications, the first newspapers, like this, the first ever newspaper, published in 1609. This is the first surviving copy. In this way, the new energy and new markets unlocked by Luther were maintained along with a newly engaged reading public. Luther created a new public for books, and once they had started buying books, they had the habit and they continued it. And this too was part of the heritage of Luther's extraordinary engagement with print. Thank you very much.
Professor Pettegree. I think we have a bit of time to take some questions. So, questions, please send them forward. And I'll let Professor Pettegree reveal.
Could you say a little bit about the cost to the buyer of these early publications and how that changed? And I think particularly in light of what the literacy rate for humanity is.
Well, thank you for asking that. That's an important question. It is said that the price charged for Gutenberg's Bible in the first age of print was equivalent to the cost of 2 or 3 small townhouses in Mainz. This was truly a luxury item. And when you bought it, of course, you got it uncoloured. You still had to do all the colouring in. By the time we get to Luther and his pamphlets, you're probably talking about one of those little pamphlets, the equivalent of 1 or 2 pence, and maybe 6 eggs, a chicken, a couple of pints of beer. So not a negligible cost for people with relatively little disposable income, but something that was possible to be contemplated for a wide circle of potential buyers. Now, literacy. I think it's fair to say that in the German cities, probably by this point, male literacy was up to about 50%. That did not necessarily mean that people first heard of Luther's teaching by reading about it. Most likely they would have heard from their own preacher. And in most cities which adopted Luther's teaching, it was a local charismatic preacher supporting Luther who made the first inroads. And people are generally speaking buying these pamphlets out of curiosity and sometimes as reinforcement because they're already attracted to him. Female literacy in this period lags a long way behind because literacy is very closely connected to occupational need. But this changes very much, largely as a result of Luther, who insists on the importance of there being girls' schools as well as boys' schools. And literacy, in consequence, female literacy makes a huge step forward in the century of Protestant Germany after Luther. Sorry, please.
I'm interested in the relationship between Luther and Cranach, and what do you know about Luther's interest in Cranach's artistic designs for the frontispieces and the covers of the works that he published?
There's no suggestion that either Luther or Melanchthon intervened personally in telling Cranach how to do his business. Luther was, one of the interesting things about Luther, which nothing is made of, is he came from an industrial background. His father was a copper merchant, and so he experienced all the problems of extractive industries as he lived through that his family life. And I think he knew how to trust experts. Where we do see Luther and Melanchthon intervening is in iconographical schemes like the law and the gospel, the old law and the new, or the very famous Christ and the Pope juxtapositions, which Cranach appeared produced as a sort of strip cartoon almost in the early 1520s, and Melanchthon in particular seems to be very heavily involved in the iconography of that. But as far as these designs were concerned, I think the artistic creativity of that was entirely Cranach's.
Further questions?
Please.
Another question on Cranach's frontispiece designs. You used the phrase array of magnificence, and magnificence in this era is sort of connected to Aristotelianism. Wondering if there's a connection as you see it, or if that's just a useful word for this sort of opulence generation.
Well, they're very interesting because I would not necessarily call these designs opulent, because in some ways they're characterized by a great deal of restraint. The examples I showed you before from Leipzig and Augsburg were where you create a border effect. It is very successful in marking out the title page, but it also tends to clutter and draw attention away from the text in the middle. And I think where Cranach is so successful is in providing a sense of grandeur, but without drawing attention away from the word, which of course is at the centre of Luther's teaching. It's also his most Italianate work. Cranach is known in the German Renaissance for being the sort of counter-Dürer. I mean, although they were personally acquainted and actually good friends, Cranach adopts a style which is almost consciously not Italian. And yet with these works, you can see in the scroll work, in the lightness of touch, a more Italianate style than you see in virtually any other of his work. Please.
Were there any Catholic competitors for publishing?
Well, the Catholic authors who wrote against Luther have generally speaking, not got a good hearing, any more than they did at the time. But they were extremely capable men, they were brave men, and they wrote boldly and copiously against Luther. And in theological terms, they struck some serious blows. They couldn't get a hearing, though. And they interpreted this as a conspiracy of the printers. The printers were reluctant to take their work. But printers will print anything which makes them money. And the problem was that Catholics' works weren't making money. And the sure sign of that is that although a considerable number of Catholic works were written against Luther, very few of them go into a second edition, at a time when his works were printed in 8, 10, 12 editions. The problem for the Catholics also is that one of their arguments against Luther was that the sort of issues he was ventilating in German belonged in a conversation between the clergy in Latin, in that it was inappropriate to be engaging a wider people with this. So having made that argument, it was very difficult for them then to descend into the arena and write against him in German. And it took them some time to get out of this sort of logical bind. But they did write, and they wrote well. It's just that they were drowned out.
Was the type founding going on in Wittenberg, and for a given printer, was the type exclusive, or did they buy from a bulk source or even trade?
There was no type foundry, to my knowledge, in Wittenberg. They would have been brought in from the centres of printing in places like Nuremberg, which is a major centre of metalwork, but probably also second-hand from Erfurt and Leipzig. It's very, very difficult to identify the work of printers on the basis of the types alone, because most of them are using a fairly generic body of types. What you do see sometimes is that works have a certain signature, where a combination of different typefaces on the page, or the combination, or characteristic arrangements of type betray a printer. They all have habits and idiosyncrasies. If someone was, and this is not particular to Luther, but if someone was suspected of printing something which was forbidden, the way that the authorities traced it down was that they took this piece of printing round the other print shops and said, do you recognise this work? Was this so-and-so's work? And very often they could. You know, they knew, it's a very intimate, villagey little world, and they knew each other's work. Sure.
Was there any problem with bringing Reformation literature to the Frankfurt Book Fair?
There wasn't in these early days, because the disciplinary measures which would have been necessary were not in place. I mean, if you compare the situation in Germany, which is a land of multiple small jurisdictions, with, for instance, the Netherlands, which is Charles V's own hereditary dominions, with a great deal of interest in Luther, but effectively stamped out by punitive action. There doesn't seem to have been any difficulty at all getting works to Frankfurt. Of course, Leipzig was a different matter altogether, because Duke George had entirely forbidden the sale of Lutheran works in his own dominions from the time of the Luther's condemnation onwards. And the result of that was the once proud and successful German industry, Leipzig industry, was completely shattered because they couldn't sell Luther. And that's what people wanted.
Perhaps one more question.
Please.
Yes, was Coburg able to print copies of his foil portraits of the Luthers to be sold cheaply as his pamphlets and brochures?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and the answer is that he in the early years of the Reformation, there are a lot of portraits of Luther circulating, some of which were based on Cranach originals. And how that arose was that Dürer, who had met Cranach when they both worked in Wittenberg, wrote to him and said, you really ought to do a portrait print of Luther. And he enclosed his magnificent engraving of Albrecht of Brandenburg as a model that Cranach might use. And so he did. He did two. The first one, both of Luther as monk. The first one was sent to Frederick the Wise, and the court sent it back and said, no, that's too provocative. It shows him too proud. So he did a slightly more humble version. And in the course of writing the book, which is to be raffled, I found a letter in which Luther says casually at the end, and I've enclosed 6 of Cranach's portraits, which I have, as you are, signed. Now, the idea of the celebrity picture signed with love, Barack Obama or whatever, we think of that as a modern invention. So I was thrilled to find that Luther was doing that in his own day. But he knew that his personality and his image was not only a cornerstone of the movement's interest, but his greatest protection. The more the publicity, the more he became a public figure, the less likely the church would be able to quietly do away with him. So the images actually played a very important role.
Very good. Speaking of raffles, we have our 2 winners. I've already distributed one, but there's one other. Johan Kinder, if you're here, you can come down front and claim your book. Once more, I'd like to thank Professor Pettegree. I'd also like to thank our first speaker in this series, Tom Rasher from MIA. And I guess the final thing I would encourage all of you to do is, of course, go down and see the show before January 15th. So, thanks again.